I found this article on Twitter, and the sloppiness of the thinking just in the title on its own was enough to get me to read it, and the thinking in the article itself was sloppier than I even expected, so let's go through it. The title is, I Was a Men's Rights Activist, One Man's Journey from Misogyny to Feminism. Now, one man's journey from misogyny to feminism really should mean that this confession is to having been a misogynist, that is, to actually having hated women. Not to having been a men's rights activist, unless it's also perfectly fine to say, I was a feminist, one woman's journey from misandry to men's rights activism. So, do you think that would be perfectly fine, Edwin Hodge, 36-year-old sociology PhD candidate? But I'm getting ahead of myself, so let's dive in.
I discovered the men's rights movement when I was 22.
Okay, and you're 36 now, and this is from a couple days ago. So you discovered the men's rights movement around 2002. It started with you discovering a book called Spreading Misandry.
I had never seen anything that said I, a white heterosexual male, was actually the one being discriminated against.
Then I gotta say, Edwin, on behalf of all of us who live in the real world, I really envy your sheltered existence. Listen, newsflash, discrimination occurs by and against every race, every gender, every sexual orientation, yes, including white heterosexual males, and yes, even back in 2002. I really don't understand how anyone could reach the age of 22 without knowing that unless they were raised like the Bubble Boy. So the mere fact of the existence of a book about one particular flavor of discrimination really shouldn't have surprised you, no matter what that flavor of discrimination was.
The book talked about how pop culture demonized straight white men because they're the only demographic left that it's acceptable to make fun of.
Well, considering the number of racist and sexist videos MTV News and BuzzFeed keep shitting out lately, not just making fun of white men, but actively demonizing them and blaming all the world's problems on them, don't you think there might be just a little bit of truth to that? Now, I'm not going to speak about 2002 because I was too young at the time to care. But let's be real here, you're speaking from 2016 and I am too, and you clearly intend to imply that this is not true today.
The chapter that stood out the most was about how men are portrayed as these bumbling oafs on television, especially sitcoms.
Okay, so it wasn't a book about misandry. Or at least that chapter wasn't. It wasn't about an actual hatred of men expressed in the media. It was just some idiot complaining that the lead characters in comedy shows tend to be written funny and stupid. The specific example being Tim Allen in Home Improvement. It's the same sort of nonsense we get now about women in video games. So yeah, spoiler alert, the author of the article ultimately decides that he disagrees with all this stuff, in case that wasn't abundantly clear from the title. So okay, we can agree that when you whine about characters not being written the way you'd personally prefer, it does come off as a little bit ridiculous.
Looking back, I realize Home Improvement was actually reproducing 1950s gender dynamics. It was about a ridiculously successful man who had his own TV show, was his own boss, and took over the entire garage so he could spend all his free time fixing up old cars. His wife, however, was relegated to the domestic sphere, and even though she had a job, it was always incidental to her role as a mother and wife.
Oh my fucking god. Yeah, dude, that's because Home Improvement was Tim Allen's show, and he didn't spend all his time wherever the fuck Jill worked, but he did spend time at home. So when they interacted, it naturally tended to be at home, where she was the mother and wife, and he was the father and husband. It was primarily a show about these people's family life, so of course they were largely defined by their family roles. The only way for the show to concentrate on Jill's job would have been to turn her into a second main character, basically, and nobody wanted that, any more than they wanted to see more of the kids. Not because they were kids or female, but because they were boring and cringy. Maybe if they'd made Jill more entertaining, more of a bumbling oaf, if you will, she would have been more fun to watch. Do you remember the plotline about Jill getting her PhD? And neither does anyone else. You know, come to think of it, I'm not really sure why I watched that show. Oh yeah, right, we had no internet connection. So anyway, you point out some book where some hypersensitive asshole is offended by a TV show for no good reason, and then instead of rejecting him for the reason that his reaction is so ridiculous it might actually play well in a goofball sitcom, you share the reaction, but you just think it should have been caused by a different interpretation of the show. Listen up, authors. Author of the article and author of the book. You're both fucking idiots. And you could both use a major upgrade to the sense of perspective modules in your brains.
The bookstore had this policy that allowed employees to essentially check out a book and report back to their colleagues about it. I came back a week later and told them about spreading misandry.
Okay, well, in most places that wouldn't be a work-appropriate topic, probably, but maybe it was considered a bit more acceptable since it's a bookstore that sells all kinds of books, and it's helpful if the employees are educated about them and are open to talking about any of them if they want to be able to deal with the customers. As you say, it was meant to increase the literacy of the staff to sell books more effectively, so Really, any subject should have been open to discussion, at least.
You know, this guy has some valid points, although some parts are a little extreme, I said. All the staff members present were women, most of them university students, some older women, and they started warily eyeing each other as I talked. A woman in her 50s looked at me for about 40 seconds of awkward silence before the manager said, "Okay, thanks for that."
So, in other words, the mere fact that you chose to read a book on a subject they didn't like turned them into complete assholes. Seriously, she stared at you in silence for 40 fucking seconds? How much more rude can anyone possibly get? And you even told them that some of what was said was a bit extreme for you, but you found some valid points. And instead of asking what these valid points might have been, these oh-so-open-minded people got nervous and stared at you like you were talking about Mein Kampf, not some silly book about the representation of men in the media.
At the time, though, it was just a confirmation of misandry. Why would they be so angry if they weren't threatened by what I was saying? My co-workers were a lot less friendly to me after that.
They were less friendly to you just for your choice of books for the book report program and your agreement with some points it contained, which they couldn't even be bothered to ask you to identify, so they didn't even know what they were? They ostracized you without even knowing what they were ostracizing you for. That's crazy.
I was so confused at that time in my life, so unsure of myself that I was especially susceptible to something like men's rights. There's a lot of literature on how socially extremist groups, such as men's rights or white supremacy, exploit young men whose lives are in turmoil, their beliefs in conflict.
Are you trying to imply that the men's rights movement is a male supremacy movement? Or have you just paired it with white supremacy for no reason at all?
Spreading misandry was a recruitment piece, and I was an easy target.
You know, the way you describe that book doesn't make it sound like it was about rights at all, men's or otherwise. It sounds more like something written by the male equivalent of Anita Sarkeesian. And her ceaseless griping about cherry-picked examples of media has nothing to do with rights or lack thereof of anyone, male or female. And the same goes for the author of that book.
My girlfriend and I broke up at the end of that summer, and I was devastated.
Yeah, she probably did that because she didn't like you being, as you describe yourself, kind of an asshole.
The majority of my friends were women, but I started withdrawing from them and hanging out with guys more.
Why? Did your women friends do something to you? Or did they just start to dislike you as well because you were an asshole?
My relationship with women became less about friendship and more about who I could hook up with.
Listen, is this supposed to be tied to that book you read? Your loss of all your friends and your descent into assholedom? Because I have to say, an intelligent person would be fully capable of reading a book about negative representations of men or women in the media, and even agreeing with it, and still being friends with all of their existing friends exactly the same way as before. After all, your women friends probably weren't writers on home improvement or consciously doing anything to hurt you. But the worst thing you could say about any of them probably is that they might have continued to watch the TV show that you just decided that you didn't like for no reason. So what specifically is supposed to have changed so drastically to either cause your friends to stop hanging out with you or you to stop hanging out with them?
I adopted this rhetorical trick many men's rights activists employ. I'm not a feminist and I'm not a men's rights activist, I would say. I'm an egalitarian.
Okay, so just to be clear, this is still in 2002. Next line.
I didn't encounter the term men's rights until 2005.
2005.
I'm not a men's rights activist, I'm an egalitarian.
Edwin Hodge, 2002.
Oh hey, what's this men's rights thing?
Edwin Hodge, 2005. What a remarkably useless form of time travel you possess. Anyway, are you trying to imply that you weren't an egalitarian? I mean, at no point here have you directly said that you did not believe in equal rights for all human beings. You just said that you thought men faced some trivial issues about TV shows. But now you seem to be implying that your claim to believe in equality was just a rhetorical trick and you didn't actually believe it. So why haven't you told us what you actually thought? I mean, were you for male supremacy or something? Are you deliberately keeping this vague to avoid an honest discussion, or are you just really that bad of a writer?
Every once in a while, I'd stumble across MRAs advocating killing feminists! And I'd think to myself, that's insane!
Good, I hope you also think the same thing when you run across feminists advocating killing men or putting them in concentration camps. This kind of thing should always be condemned.
But then I'd do what a lot of MRAs do. I'd say, those voices are on the fringe, and argue they didn't speak for the movement as a whole.
And now you're a feminist, so what do you do when you hear feminists saying the same sort of thing? I suspect that you have a similar reaction. They're just fringe voices, they don't really speak for feminism. You see, your current situation is no different from your past one. So why are you phrasing this like you were wrong to treat the lunatic fringe as a lunatic fringe in the past, but you're right to do so now? Do you think that MRAs who want to kill feminists aren't on the fringe and they do speak for the movement as a whole? Because that sounds insane. And so then you went and took sociology.
I looked at the syllabus and saw books about gender from the perspective of men's lived experiences. I just thought, well, shit.
Why well shit? Because you thought you signed up for a science class, but the books were all from the perspective of lived experiences? Or in other words, full of anecdotes instead of proper evidence?
I read them, and it didn't take long for my men's rights beliefs to start falling away. They didn't stand up to all the empirical evidence I was finally reading. Lived experiences. Empirical evidence.
Lived experiences. Empirical evidence. Lived experiences. Empirical evidence.
I shared a belief common among science, engineering, and tech people that sociology wasn't a real science. It was just about feelings and how men are the root of all evil. Men are socialized to be stoic, rational beings. The only emotions were allowed are anger and joy, and in a precious few instances were allowed to cry, like if our sports team loses.
Ha 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 ha. And you're allowed to act however the fuck you want, as if that even needs to be said. Stop being so goddamn worried about what other people think of you and just be you. You make it sound like the fucking secret police are gonna show up and drag you away if you cry once too often. Christ.
As an MRA, I always believed it was women and feminism putting men in this box.
You were an MRA? When? At no point in this article, except the title, have you said or indicated that at any point up to this point you were ever a men's rights activist or even an advocate. You just seem to have been anti-feminist, and you seem to have a big victim complex based on what you said earlier.
I didn't encounter the term men's rights until 2005, right before social media really took off. I'd Google men's oppression or anti-feminist and find anything I was looking for on people's blogspot sites or in the comments on pre-Reddit sites like Fark, and of course 4chan.
Yeah, so you'd encountered the term men's rights by then, but instead of Googling that, you'd Google men's oppression and anti-feminist. As I said, a victim complex and some anti-feminism, but no mention of when or if you became a men's rights activist or advocate. So since you appear to have missed a critical paragraph in your article, could you provide some details on when and why you became an MRA and what you did in terms of activism or advocacy?
Men are socialized to be stoic, rational beings. As an MRA, I always believed it was women and feminism putting men in this box.
Yeah, as I said before, you're an idiot. Why would you believe women and feminism were primarily responsible for promoting masculine stereotypes and convincing men to act accordingly? Men push other men to act masculine just like women push other women to act feminine. It's a thing of fitting in with the group. And some women push men to act masculine by making fun of them if they don't, or choosing guys who do, just like some men push women to act feminine by making fun of them if they don't, or choosing women who do. And some people push men to act more feminine, a lot of feminists do that, and some people push women to act more masculine. What should be blindingly obvious is that there's all kinds of influences all over the place. This simplistic thing that apparently you used to actually believe that it's just women and feminism is so stupid I had to read it about 5 times to make sure you actually said it.
MRAs and feminists were acknowledging the same problems, but the MRAs weren't locating the right cause.
What problems? You haven't pointed out any problems except maybe that peer pressure is a thing.
The feminists pointed out, no, actually this is rooted in the same patriarchal institutions that are harming women. It was subtle, but profound.
Okay, so apparently patriarchy is just a synonym for peer pressure, regardless of whether those peers happen to be male or female. I must say, I don't find this particularly subtle or profound. If a woman happens to make fun of another woman for not shaving her legs, and you call that patriarchy, I'm sorry to say, but that strikes me as obscurantism, not profundity.
And feminism showed that men of color and queer men experience the world differently than the straight white men who dominate MRA groups and assume all men are fundamentally the same and like them.
Your only examples of talking points within the men's rights movement is that home improvement was mean to Tim Allen, and executing feminists sounds like a good idea. Those aren't issues I've ever heard an MRA mention, but fine. Let's pretend the movement is as dogshit as you say it is, and those are its only talking points. How can you be such an asshole as to suggest that these are straight, white talking points? No, it couldn't possibly be that these guys are just assholes, and assholes can be any color or have any sexual orientation, or any gender for that matter, since Anita Sarkeesian and Bahar Mustafa fall into the same category. No, non-white men and gay men are fundamentally different than those bastard straight white men who want to kill all the feminists. And you definitely knew the skin color and sexual orientation of every single one of those men on those forums that you frequented. They were all straight white men, and they were assholes because they were straight and white. Fuck yourself.
I realized all the arguments about male oppression I'd bought into were weak, and all the evidence I needed was in feminism.
Yeah, don't bother looking at all the evidence, just look at the feminist evidence. You know, the evidence produced by biased research that was informed by feminist theory. That always works out really well. It totally doesn't make you sound like you're talking about how you became a creation scientist doing research informed by the Bible.
I would write these pro-men's rights arguments that I thought made sense, but my instructors would say, this is a tautology.
What, every time? So to take an example of an MRA argument, we should not permit parents to mutilate their sons' bodies because the concept of consent should matter in this country. That's a tautology! If that's not the sort of argument you mean, then how terrible were you as a thinker that every single one of your arguments weren't only poorly constructed or easily dismantled, but specifically tautological?
At one point, I made the argument that metrosexualism was oppressive to men, that it was an attempt to feminize us because we were too hairy.
Jesus, you really were a whiny piss baby, weren't you?
One of my female peers turned to me, lifted up her skirt, and said, I shave my legs every day. Don't talk to me about the cosmetics industry oppressing men.
You say that like you think she has a point. She doesn't. You're both idiots. Her choice to shave her legs is not an argument against your position about metrosexualism being created to oppress you, or what the fuck ever. It's not even a related topic other than both of them happening to involve hair. So your acceptance of her non-argument is pretty bad, but the main point is this. No matter what gender you are, if you don't want to shave your body hair, guess what? Revolutionary information here, people. You're allowed to throw away your razor. You won't even be put in prison, I promise. At the very worst, someone on the street might give you a funny look, or someone else might not choose to go on a date with you, and that's it. If you aren't completely self-obsessed, and also obsessed with what other people think of you, and also obsessed with obeying your gods in the TV and the magazines, you're not gonna care. And neither will pretty much anyone else. In the words of Who the Fuck Knows, you wouldn't worry so much about what others think of you if you realized how seldom they do. Look, just because the magazine has a picture of someone who looks a certain way, you have no obligation to try to look that way. If you dedicate any of your time to looking that way for any reason other than it's what you actually want, then I find you to be a very silly person, and you deserve all the misery that you bring on yourself by falling for such complete nonsense. You've made a religion of consumerism and conformity, and I have absolutely no sympathy for you.
My focus is still on men. That much hasn't changed since my MRA days. But my work recognizes that the single most powerful set of tools for understanding the issues men face can be found in feminist analysis.
Okay, so what issues do men face, in your opinion? Do you focus on criticism of home improvement episodes? Or do you actually focus on real issues related to rights violations and so on? You know, those things that might be called, men's rights?
Despite my best efforts, I'm an idealist, and I honestly, truly believe sociology can be an activist discipline. It can teach young people how our society constructs inequality, and once we start down that road, we can do something about it. Sociology wasn't a real science. Activist discipline.
Sociology wasn't a real science. Activist discipline. Sociology wasn't a real science. Activist discipline.
Hey, do you want to know what actual scientific disciplines aren't? Activist. You might want to stop using that to defend sociology. Just a thought. Wait, if those men's issues you focus on include rights, and you use sociology as a tool for activism for this cause, does that make you a men's rights activist?
There are some MRAs who claim men's rights is akin to feminism, but that's incorrect.
The supposed men's rights movement you've described in this article, whether accurate or not, certainly is akin to the kind of feminism that you appear to now accept. Small-minded, obsessed with petty nonsense like TV characters and fashion, empty of any human rights issues, basically a bunch of spoiled little kids play-acting as grown-ups without any understanding at all of the real challenges of adult life. A representation in miniature of the complete infantilization of our culture for which I'm beginning to lose hope in ever finding a remedy.
The men's rights movement has always been anti-feminist first, men's issues second.
Okay, whatever. That doesn't equate to misogyny any more than the lack of women's issues in this feminist anti-MRA article equates to misandry. You know, throughout this article you've made it very clear that as a feminist you behave and think no differently than you did as a men's, not rights activist, since rights seem not to have been a topic, men's strongly worded complaint letter to ABC-ist.